So
Okay.
welcome back. I've been wanting to do this video for a very long time, and now everything just sort of has fallen into place. And I'm very excited to say hello to Mr. Perry Clark.
Hello there.
Hi. So we actually met in person. Was it last year? No, two
At
years ago.
at Comic-Con.
Yeah, and ever since then, I've been wanting to hear more about your experience and everything. And it just we were still waiting to get ready for the YouTube channel, and so I wanted to have a place for you to be able to share all your wisdom with us, so everybody can benefit from it. So I think we are at that point now. So I'm very excited to hear about sort of like your story and how you got started. I know we talked about comic books before. Is that your sort of like entrance, I guess, to the geek world?
I wouldn't. Okay, so the closest I would say we have to go back in the Wayback Machine. My interest to the geek world, because I will be 74. That's not 74, 47 this year. So I grew up in the 80s. I'm an 80s kid. So I grew up
Hmm.
with a lot of syndicated television and reruns. And so the reruns I started watching, thanks to my mother, were Star Trek and Doctor Who,
Oh, okay. Wow.
which also included things like the original Mission Impossible series. I'm not talking about Tom Cruise whatsoever. Uh, the original episodes of Battlestar Galactica, um, a lot of those shows, and then here, lo and behold, here's comic books. So it's helping me with my reading as well, because as it was, I was at that point in time, all my dyslexia was present, but no one could actually recognize what it was, because it wasn't matching the diagnostics model.
Ah, is that something that went under undiagnosed until adulthood?
No, my entire school years, there was always known that I had some sort of learning disability, but they never actually could say what it was. It was unspecified.
Okay. What was it like back in the day? Because I hear stories about people, especially comic book lovers, who
Mhm.
sort of had almost in a way like two lives where they like absolutely love comic books and they have like maybe friends that they share that with, and then like friends that they never talked about comic books with.
Well, I kind of found myself, again, with that standpoint of okay, so I grew up here in the Silicon Valley. So I was often the only black kid in most of my classes until we started getting
Mm.
to middle school and into high school. So I was often alone. And so at that point, the closest character I've any type of uh, kinsmanship with was Spock. I found my kinship with Uhura later on in life, but Spock was the closest one that I could find similarities with, being the only alien on that ship.
Oh, I see. Okay.
And that was the closest example of one of the characters I could sort of model my life off of. Next was the Doctor, of course. Um, so growing up being the only black kid in the class, not to mention now also having my learning disabilities, my learning differences coming up there, that very much created isolation.
Yeah, I can
So
imagine.
the standpoint of having the friend, it's not so much of the friends that I can share this with and friends I can, is like a lot of times I had very few people I could share my interest with. So it's sort of that aspect of I've always been on the periphery.
When was it that, because for me I kind of like uh I was actually, I think I was streaming the other day and I was just sort of like talking, like rambling on, and then I realized that um my brother is actually to blame for a lot of like my geeky interests. He was the one that
Mhm.
introduced me to them, and of course I was like, yes, I love all of these.
Yep.
And I started, I guess, my entrance to the geek community, the geek culture, was actually fan fiction That's how
Mm,
I got started, because I think it was around 7th grade where I discovered how amazing reading could be and how much I loved it. And then I just kept reading. And I think eventually I just kind of got tired, or maybe I grew the local library that we had. And our high school didn't have a great selection of books I could check out either.
mm,
And fan fiction was free and easily
mhm,
available. And by that time, I was in high school. I already had like my own phone. I had a computer, so it was easily accessible to
mhm,
me. And so that's kind of how I got started but it wasn't until I started grad school that I met other people that that went to Comic-Con and watched the same things that I did, that
mhm,
I kind of became more comfortable um in expressing like how geeky I was, or like getting into like other fandoms and stuff.
mhm.
When was that experience for you? When did you
So
experience that comfort
I
level?
started finding at least some degree of people I started having more in common with in high school. I had a
Mm-hmm.
small group of friends that I was pretty much around, and they came to my birthday, and my mother had gotten me, at this point, DS9 had started, Star Trek Deep Space Nine, and my cake had Quark's face on it.
Oh.
And so they're there for that. But no, I mean, it wasn't until high school that I started finding more people that I could have some degree of that aspect of my geekiness, my sense that that was what was important to me, that's what fascinated me, uh, to have some sort of kinship with.
Mhm,
Because even though still, even with my dyslexia, and which I also suspect I also have dyscalculia too, um, it also became an aspect of when it became apparent to certain aspects of my parents where I was clearly doing things that were more connected to that.
mhm,
They got me more uh, novels, more books that were science fiction, fantasy, and other things. And equally, because of the way their relationship was, if we went on a family trip, I would be packing 4, 5, 6 books to be sitting in the back of the car reading just to tune them out when they were in their spats.
mhm.
So science fiction, fantasy, high fantasy, horror to a certain extent, they have been my greatest refuge getting through life.
Okay, so I am scaredy cat, and I
Mhm,
don't like watching like horror movies or scary movies, but I do love stories. I have always been uh, sort of like fascinated by like history, and essentially like history is just stories that just get told,
mhm.
So like just any type of like stories, and but I'm too scared to watch like to watch the movies, so I just want to hear like the stories of it. So I want to hear more about your perspective on like horror, and like what that's like.
Well, and so for also those who are listening, I do have a podcast too called Untying Knots, Minds, and Souls Untethered, and I had a conversation with Tanana Reeve Dew, which also is the realization that just like we have our subgenres in science fiction from hard science to fantasy science,
Hmm.
there's also subgenres in horror as well.
Okay.
And so it's also about figuring out what's your subgenre. So you like history. So there you're going to be looking
Okay.
more for historical horror, or what you're looking because of our field, you might be looking more for psychological horror
Okay.
compared to the gore fest.
I mean, I like that because I watch anime, and there are
Hmm.
some like
Yeah,
anime that I watch that it can be described as very, very gory. So that's
right.
not the aspect that scares me. I think it's more uh sort of like the I guess the psychological aspects of it. And those are very scary to me. But yeah, but I've been super interested in that, and actually I did a brief search because I wanted to learn more about what attracts people to, I guess, that genre, or like just not
Mhm.
just comic books, but like movies and stuff like that in general.
Well, one
And
thing,
there isn't a lot of like research out there. Um,
not
in
surprising.
terms of like why people tend to like it, other than, it's sort of like, I guess the unknown, or the, we get
Well,
curious about things.
Well, again, it's not surprising there isn't a lot of research on it because, again, we've also still got a lot of issues around our world with the idea of escapism. And there's a lot of forces that have continued for most of our lifetime in this century and the century before, seeing escapism as people not taking responsibility. So why would they put energy
Mhm.
into it? And it even gets back into some of our deeper issues, even in our profession, around the idea of how our profession has also been used to vilify people as a mechanism of control, um, from things like drapomania, which was the runaway slave syndrome, to recognition of LGBT as being not being a deviant part of the um, DSM, to the idea of people need escapes from life all the time. The question is whether or not that escape has become destructive. But in that same standpoint, to bring it back to what we're talking about, is that standpoint of where do we have control?
Mhm.
And there are a large number of people of color who are horror fans. There are a large number of people of color who are sci-fi and fantasy people as well. But again, what's the sort of default standard around all of those things? What is the default reasonings? Because the idea of this being something that is not ours, even though we enjoy it, is again about control.
Mhm. Yeah. So okay. So real quickly, this is like completely off topic for this podcast interview thing. But if somebody were to be sort of interested, aka me, and
Mm,
maybe other people, into joining, or like in like joining the horror fandom,
mhm.
what would be your initial recommendations for them? Do you have any
Well,
recommendations of like things to read or watch?
well, um, again, I'm a child of the '80s, so I grew up with a lot of Friday the 13th and Nightmare on Elm Street and so forth as being some of the early introductions, even though should not have watched, as my mother would have said, I should not have been watching all of those. So I thank my aunt for that. Um, but what I would probably introduce now, if you're not looking for the gore fest, which is most Hollywood, Hollywood movies, I'd actually invite you to consider checking out Symphony Entertainment online. They're interested in Call of Cthulhu, which I know goes to Lovecraft, which I know is also he's had racist points in that matter. But I would also point out there is a larger movement to pull away from what he created and start expanding out. So there's that. So I'm going to just throw out, look at on YouTube, Symphony Entertainment. They do a number of role-playing games around the Call of Cthulhu, as well as other horror indie RPGs. I am one of the cast on there too, so periodically I'll be on there for a game based in a horror setting that we get to play out. And actually, the first game I did on there was called Miskatonic Shoreside Conservatory, where I played a black character who was dealing with the mythos, but his biggest drive was he wanted to reconnect with his family. That ultimately meant certain choices and various Cthulhu monsters that I found out I had a relationship with, but I'm not going to give you that spoilers. You got to go watch it to see.
You know what? This is actually an excellent recommendation, because I feel like the world of RPG adds maybe sort of
Hmm.
like an extra layer of distance, right?
Hmm.
Because it's not something that you're visually seeing. It's just more like where you're hearing other people,
Hmm.
um, like. And also there's the element of like you have to roll the dice, and there's
Hmm.
it's not like full on, like sort of like scripted, all of
Hmm.
that. So
Hmm.
this is a great recommendation. I think I'm gonna check it out, because I've been wanting like so bad to learn more about this world. I mean, like all curious about it. So yeah, thanks so much about for that recommendation. And then so kind of like slowly moving to the point of this podcast.
Right.
eh, um how did you get started in the field of mental health?
Well, let's see here. That's its own rather long and roundabout story because I went to school for my bachelor's. I started there. I started at San Jose State in engineering. Come to realize, again, we hadn't really realized just how much my learning differences were getting in the way of things.
Mm-hmm.
And so I left engineering and I got my basic degree in creative arts. So
Okay.
that was general art and technical theater set design. And
Okay.
again,
Awesome.
because of my desire and joys of sci-fi shows, I had always wanted to be a prop or set designer on a sci-fi show. Well, hence why I took the theater and set design components of it. So I learned a bit
Uh-huh.
from that. But the difference, of course, being it's not what you know, it's who you know, which I wasn't at a place yet to start understanding that difference.
Mm-hmm.
So I completed that, and I then started doing a myriad of different jobs pretty much for the next 10 years. Um, from, and I'll put it this way, I was chasing the money, which was not the best thing for me. All of during this time, I was also getting deeper into my own spirituality. I
Mm-hmm.
identify as sort of pagan spiritualist, so I'm not any of the big main three. So in some ways, my spirituality was working in its own way as being part of my mental health journey.
Okay.
And I had reached a point where I was in a more, let's call it receptive state to listen to the universe. And I was standing in a friend's metaphysical shop that they had just recently opened. And he was giving me a tour of the space. And I walked in and he showed me, oh, this is the room where we do shamanic healing. And so I'm just sort of looking into this room, taking it. Um, so going back into the standpoint of we're chasing the material gain. There's a lot of what has been structured into our world as we sit right now about the material gain is the most important thing. We see that even to what we're seeing on Instagram and all of that. Um, and psychology itself, which in all honesty, I think has been around since the dawn of humanity, it's just the name and structure we're looking at it from is younger in that standpoint. It's being more of a thing with like, at least in Western culture, in for with Freud and so forth. So you've already got what like
Mhm.
six. So that
Yeah.
form being of it, and that's where it grew out of uh, biological medicine to look at the mind, because again, the principle being of so much of that thinking at that time in Western thought versus indigenous thought is that the brain is the king. If we can solve the structures of the brain, the neuroscience, and so forth, we can rule everything.
Yes, I think the emphasis of or uh the composition of what made us, I think, switched a little bit. And
Mhm.
and I think it's kind of like trying to switch back again to the
Well,
original way to sort of include that as well.
I wouldn't so much say it's trying to switch back, is going back is not also a good thing. Because also what was before, because again, we look at the battleground that came in between spirituality and science. We need a blending of the two.
Hmm.
We need to now exist with the two reconnected and functioning together as opposed to a divorce between the two.
Yes. Or
And
or this sort of like separation of like each one of them is like in its own sort of like little box.
exactly. And so I'm in this roundabout way. As I'm getting deeper into my spirituality, I am also dealing with the standpoint of one of the ideas of one called spiral time, which is much more as opposed to linear time.
Hmm.
So Western world's linear, indigenous, and more of the spirituality is what's known as a spiral time. With that comes also with the idea, principle of dynamism, being that all things are being connected and all things are being acted upon by different forces. So the moment I was walking out of Home Depot as I had been working as a merchandiser, and I was in a foul mood from being at that place, listening to people come in and ask for various things that they were putting in so that they could make the house inspection and then ripping out or they couldn't find that exact color that they wanted in this by this manufacturer. It's just like I was in a foul mood. And I walked out of that work day. I was putting stuff in my car, and this elderly black man who's clearly not fully present in his mind walked up and said, "I'll load your car for a burger." And I said, "Thank you, no, I couldn't do that." And I got in with my car, and it's just like, what the fuck am I doing with my life? He was that catalyst moment that just started me like, what am I doing with all of this? I am miserable doing this work. I am still struggling to do all this work and make a living. And mind you, it's all about close to the period of 2008. So we've had the dot-com crash, and we're heading next towards the mortgage crash that was in the world. And all the while, it's like, okay, so I need to start shifting myself away from this. What can I do? Well, my mother was a nurse. So what if I got into medicine? Now, I know I'm going to have to take some more education for this. So what's the easiest way for me to start making that switch, get into medicine, and go from there? Because it was familiar. And I went into phlebotomy. Did a year of the courses to do that and moved into that field. And managed to get a trial at a hospital. Didn't go well. But I continued doing phlebotomy, and I started working for the medical examiners who do insurances. And while, again, I'm bringing now in enough money to sustain myself, I'm still not bringing in enough to be comfortable. And I'm still not happy. And this is about the point where in my spiritual journey and so forth, and I'm visiting this friend in the metaphysical store when I hear in my head, clear as a day, go study psychology. And that was like March. And I was sort of hemming and hawing, questioning it. And, it's like, I'll go explore what I can at the schools that are around me. And found a school that I felt like, it's like, this is the place, I'll go. And so I went ahead and tried and submitted for it. And I was doing the exploration of the schools in April. I submitted my applications in May and had my interview, and I was accepted in June. And so I was like, oh shit, I'm on this path. And scrambling to get the financial aid, because that was the only way I was going to pay for this, and started updating the stuff that had been missed in my after my undergrad. And that was 2010 when I had started that. And as on reflection, I did very much enjoy my psychology classes in undergrad. And I would also bring that back to an appeal from, again, those syndicated shows I like to watch. The Prisoner, the original Prisoner, not the one that they tried to do in 2020, which that original series was based off of Skinner's behavioral work. So there was already a chance I was being exposed to psychological principles with that. And come to think about it, and again, one of those differences between the original Mission Impossible series and what we're seeing now, original Mission Impossible series was about psychological warfare and psyops, about how to manipulate somebody into doing the things they needed, or creating the exposure that was needed for them to make this impossible mission work. As opposed to how many stunts can Tom Cruise do?
Okay, honestly, I didn't know there was an original Mission Impossible.
Oh, yeah. Which I'm also going to add is that was another one of my foundational characters. While I didn't click with horror in Star Trek, I did click with Greg Morris's character in Mission Impossible, because he's one of the only constant characters in that entire series, and he's the only black man, and he's the engineer.
Ah, okay.
So I've got the scientist in Spock, I've got the bumbling scientist hero in the Doctor, and I've got the engineer in Greg Morris, his Barney character in Mission Impossible.
So how did because again, like I think for me and for most of us, I think in the mental health field, opening our own practice isn't sort of like our first thought. How was your sort of like journey of discovering that you wanted to have your own practice?
So as I start going into my classes, we're probably in the first semester of it, as I'm just sort of sitting in, taking in the classes and so forth. It's like, I want private practice. I do not want to be working at an agency for the rest of my life. I do not want, there was just stuff I was already, again, collecting in this structure that I was seeing. And we can say this is in the university, being able to read other bits of information, because I was already sensing that.
Yeah.
That there were structures I did not really want to be in long term. And so thought is like, okay, one way or another, I need to go to private practice. That's the direction course I need to be going in. And as I started continuing my courses, started learning more about psychology, I'm again also seeing where are those structures that I don't agree with, I don't fit with.
Mm-hmm.
In like the aspect of how much of most of my coursework is all still based in Western Europe, and white therapists, white psychologists who are part of what became part of Drapomania, part of the idea that LGBT existence needs to be pathologized. And so I'm seeing that dearth, and where am I going and finding that material for myself? And at one point, brief period of time, I was part of the Association of Black Psychologists as well. So I'm looking at this difference that I'm seeing in about what's getting normalized, both good and bad. And it's like, no, either way, I want private practice. I thought I wanted an agency because it was going to pay off my student loans, which is a viable path for people. I'm not going to knock that. But you got to be able to survive that long enough for that to be able to kick in if you can get it.
Yeah, and I think that's from my experience. It's very different from yours because I didn't have that sort of like life experience that brought you that wisdom to know what you wanted. I
Mm,
I had like part-time jobs and things, but I never sort of knew about all the things that I didn't agree with in terms of
mhm,
like different organizations and stuff. And that wasn't until I either was in grad school or afterwards, where I was trying
mm,
to figure out like what I wanted to do with like the rest of my life kind of thing, or like what I wanted to do with my degree. And in essence, like you kind of had that extra knowledge, and that leveled you up. I guess as a
so,
therapist, because I had a lot of people who start like some sort of like mental health or psychology program
mhm,
as their second career or their third career, and then they're like,
mhm,
oh well, I wish I knew about this at an earlier age. And I'm like, but all those experiences that you had before like only add so much richness to how you are as a therapist. So like
mhm.
you wouldn't be the same therapist you are now if you didn't have those experiences
Right.
from before.
Yeah. Because fundamentally, I actually consider this my first actual career,
Hmm.
and that really began at 40. Compared again to the notions and push that we have to have this at 20.
Yeah, and again, like from someone who did or tried to. I'm in my 30s now,
Mm,
but it's it's so much different because there's so much you still have to learn.
mhm,
And I think I was very lucky that I had. So one of the things that I realized of, uh, or like cemented the idea of this is what I want to do for the rest of
mm,
my life was. Um, because I started realizing how easy or how comfortable I felt reaching out to people.
mhm,
to do collaborations, where before, just the idea of networking with other people, I was like, I would rather not. I would rather just do it by myself or not go to these networking events. And now I'm like, wait, oh no, I want to do other collaborations because I want to know about your fandoms. I want to know about how you like it's such like a different sort of like world, because I'm so much familiar with like this culture. And
Mm.
so connecting with other like geeky nerdy therapists is so much easier for me than connecting to someone who is not part of that, geeky nerdy culture. Um,
Which,
and
yeah, yeah.
go ahead.
Well, I think that goes back to what your earlier question is like, where did I find my connection with my peers and so forth in elementary, middle school? It wasn't until I finally got to high school
Mhm.
that I finally started finding some people that I could connect with. And the aspects of what we're dealing with mental health, and let alone geek mental health, has again come from a large place where we're on the periphery. Only in this century have we become more mainstream.
But I think too, there's a lot of things that I would like to address too about like the geek culture, because a lot of it has changed to become
Mhm.
more accessible for
Right.
everyone. Because I posted something about watching anime, and then someone's like, "Oh, why do we have like all this kind of anime? We don't have a lot of anime for kids." Now it's more accessible.
So I know exactly what you're saying, and I know I've noticed this for myself too. The concepts, and this again is getting into what and how we're viewing the material, the idea,
Mhm,
and because again, this also gets into culture too. In America, culture, cartoons and anime are always for kids.
mhm,
They're never for any other age group.
right.
Compared to Japan, where you can have anime designed and stories designed for every age group.
Exactly.
Now,
And I think
but there's one other element too, especially when we're dealing with Western, is like how much has also the idea of a cartoon been tied to products, toy manufacturing, and so forth. I mean, again, I'm a child of the 80s. I grew up with Transformers. I had as many of those toys as possible. And going back and looking at some of the animations stories then versus now, it's like, wow. I can see the product placement that they're doing, that they pumped into me at that time. I can see it's like, wait a minute, there could be so much more to this story. And that was satisfying for me at that time. Wow.
I think that's why I vibed with anime so much, because there's so much depth, like another layer of depth to the
Mhm.
stories that we don't see often in Western media. And I think that, I don't know, that's why I sort of want other people to understand that culture, because there's also too this fear of for many of us, this was sort of like a safe space, like you identify with like those characters.
Mhm.
And I had like characters that I identify with, and
Mhm.
then when um new people come in and then they view them differently or they treat them differently, then it causes that, no, this is no longer a safe space. Like, this used to be
Mhm.
my safe space. Why are you here? So then it becomes
Mhm.
sort of like this gatekeeping
Mhm.
thing, where like it's like this excitement of, yes, more people are interested in the things that I'm interested, but also please don't change anything. I love just the way it is. And it can be very um it can be hurtful for long-term fans and for new fans that are very excited and really want to dig into um, the history of that fandom, or wanting to join for the right reasons, not just
Mhm.
because it's popular. And it can be kind of intimidating sometimes to join certain fandoms because of that.
Right. But this is also another example of what we're talking about with mental health. So much of the reaction about I don't want it to change is sticking with one, nostalgia about what it was like at a different time in life, and the aspect of the part of themselves that is stuck in that nostalgia. Was it ever permitted to grow? Was it ever permitted to evolve? Or did whatever the trauma and the experiences of that time say we must keep this safe, we must keep that idea safe, let alone getting it to grow. And that's what I think we see a lot with the gatekeeping. I think we see that a lot with the toxic fandom.
And I think that's why I highly encourage like other therapists, even if they don't identify themselves as geeky or nerdy therapists, we still have to ask about sort of like geek culture, because it's such, for those of us who do identify as part of it, it's such an ingrained part of us that not addressing it in the session, it can make the
Well,
process longer and hinder any progress.
agreed. And again, this also it goes into some larger areas too, where we're also looking at our profession of what's the median age of most people in our profession. How many have done this as a second or third career? And what 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 biases that get brought in from their old careers? For just the simple fact, and I remembered this during my training for it, there were points where I was talking to some of my colleagues, especially some of the ones that were older, and they couldn't understand why Gears of War storyline was something that was so fascinating to the kids that they were trying to sit and work with. Why the modern Transformers were such gear, and I had to say to them, "Is like these are the fairy tales of their time."
Mm-hmm.
So it's going to behoove you to actually start learning what these stories are, because Cinderella doesn't cut it for everybody anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And there's that standpoint of where we've got both generational thinking and generational professional thinking not keeping pace with everything. As our own field evolves in our understanding about what mental health is, what we have to start accounting more with the areas of, say, trauma, what we start have to accounting more for the standpoints of us being in private practice. I was talking to one therapist. He was going to school in, I think it was the 50s or it's the 60s, somewhere in that time frame.
Mm-hmm.
And he said to me is that when they were being trained at that point in time, the goal and standard was for them to all go into agency. Private practice was a fluke. Private practice was the thing to be poo-pooed.
Mm-hmm.
Then as we get to the 80s, we get that switch from everything we're doing in mental health, everything we're doing is going into an agency, is going into private practice and or group practice. And
Yeah.
so again, there's the aspect of that thinking of you're going into a county or government agency that you're going to spend the rest of your life at.
Right.
And so that thinking of what are we doing to be able to fit into the agency culture, the agency management style, the manualization of therapy is different from what you're going to be dealing with when you're thinking about private practice.
And it really is, because in an agency, it's very difficult to bring in new ideas, and
Mm-hmm.
that's part of the reason why I felt like I didn't, because my brain is constantly thinking of how to improve it, how to make it better,
Well,
and it
not
was such a
thinking
struggle to
yeah,
do
not
that.
just the thinking of doing better is like, and this is the fundamental thing too, is depending again on the manualization, it is very easy for a person of color to be listed as treatment non-compliant.
Yeah.
As opposed to saying, was this the treatment that was most appropriate for this person? And if this treatment is not the one that's appropriate for this person, and we are strictly holding to a certain manualized therapy model, we can't treat this person. So therefore, that person is cast back out with their mental illnesses issues and their life issues versus, and I bring this to private practice, I have more flexibility to go into those other areas that will be better fits for this person.
Yes, I think when I was in school, there was just this idea of the client not being ready. It
Mm-hmm.
was never never mentioned or hinted at of maybe it's the therapist that's not ready, or maybe it's not the correct therapy, or maybe I'm not, the
Mm-hmm.
therapist to help them. It
Mm-hmm.
was always like they're not ready. We have to wait
Oh,
until they're ready.
that's all of those other things are also very true as well. You have, and this is where we're looking at cognitive dissonance. All of those things can be true. The question is, which ones are the ones that are actually getting in the way of this moving forward? Is the client not
Mhm,
ready for therapy? That's very true. We have, I mean, even especially with mandated therapy, doesn't mean that that person really is ready for that. Is this the right therapy for that person? Not everyone works well with cognitive. Sometimes you got to
mhm,
do art-based therapy. And there are those areas where those are getting blended. Sometimes this is the wrong therapist to be working with because they cannot build a relationship with that therapist, depending on both implicit and explicit biases that are there. Is this the right time for them? If they are right now struggling to be able to pay their bills, they're in
mhm,
survival thinking. They're not in that thinking that they need to be able to have the space to be able to grow and deal with the healing and changing. So that's at least five different places and I will say as a dynamistic person, I would be looking at to see what's going on and how can I help this person, or is this the wrong time for that person? And that's not a thinking that's going to be taught by most courses, but it's
no.
also a freedom
And
I find in private practice.
and I think it's so, this is why I love talking to you because there's so many things that I can learn from you, and that made it very difficult for me to learn um, in an academic setting,
Mhm.
because the way that there's so many things that we need to change in terms of pretty much everything, like education, the workplace, just society. There's so many changes that
Yeah.
need to happen to make so many of these improvements, and it's very, very difficult. So I am hoping that with making these videos, and it will be helpful for people who are like either in grad school, thinking about going to grad school, or sort of like in the same spot where I'm at right now, where like I am barely starting my career, but um in a essence, or in a sense, I am very lucky because I can reach out to you and
Mhm.
to many people like you who are willing to do this and to give us your perspective. That it's so helpful for us, because then I can just start from a different level because you have shared all this wisdom with us. So if there are people out there who are sort of like interested um in maybe having their own private practice, or are still considering like integrating some of their their fandoms or the things
Mhm.
that they absolutely love into the therapy session, what would be some of your advice for them,
Well,
or recommendations?
one of the first and big ones is go take business classes. Go take marketing classes. As it was, I had already taken a number of those before I had started my training in psychology.
Hmm.
So that also added to my sense of I need to go to private practice. Now,
Hmm.
the idea that somebody can't do those things, one is you're over depending on your school to teach you everything you need to know. Your school is not going to teach you everything you know. They're going to teach you some of the big things to be able to function in this field, but they're not going to teach you everything. And again, there's that you go to a job and you stay there forever. There's assumption that your school is going to teach you everything. It's not. You're
Hmm.
going to go and take those additional courses, just like we have to take continuing education. None of our continuing educations are centered around just a university providing that education. So it's adjusting to that aspect of you're going to have to go out there and find what you want and what you need elsewhere. That also includes dealing with your senses about money. You're going to need to, because part of working in private practice is about setting your fees and setting the fees that are going to be able to make sure you can live. So that means, yes, you're going to have to start asking people for money or holding to the value about what you're sitting with money. And depending again on your life experiences, which is what we deal with in therapy, is your life experience. How have your life experiences set you up for success, and how they've created the obstacles? If money issues and senses of self-worth are in your way, guess what? That's what you're going to be doing in your personal therapy. You're going to be working on these things. Everything we teach help our clients do, we also have to do ourselves in various ways and degrees. You learn how to become a therapist. You can learn basic business. You can learn basic principles of advertising. You can explore and learn what it means to deal with money. There are any number of books. There is the ones that I know I've read is Lynne Twist, The Soul of Money, Overcoming Underearning by Barbara Stashwick. There is Emotional Currency, and I can't remember who the author is, but if you look, just do the title search for Emotional Currency, you will find that one. There is the Budgetnista by Tiffany Aliche, or the Budgetnista. She's another one of the business money relationship books that are out there. I'm talking pretty much learn those things, get money literate, and also know what your emotional intelligence is around money. One of the things that I operate my practice under the Profit First system. There are now books on the basic Profit First. There's Profit First for minority businesses. There's Profit First for therapists. So even if you don't have to read the other two, you can read the therapist one and get that information. Is there, but you have to go and do it, just like our clients have to come and want to go through the process of doing the work to heal. You have the work to learn to do these things beyond what is being done in school, and beyond the idea of getting a grade, because there's another aspect. Oop, your camera just left again.
There.
And it's being aware of how much of are we also building our psychological aspect off that approval system. And you're not going to, when you go out in business, you're not going to be getting a grade anymore. You're not going to be getting approval. And if you're going out here for approval on deeper things, you will actually harm people. If you feel like you need to be approved on, you need to be the rescuer, you will harm people.
There is this we have to become comfortable with not only not being the therapist to be able to help people, to getting fired by people, and to receiving negative reviews, because it's not something talked about in school either.
No, it's not talked about at school because there is still there is again, so many of these ideas that have been built into our field, even the sense, especially the sense of poverty mindset. There is a poverty mindset for some, is that we're doing all of this and we should not expect to be paid. We shouldn't expect to be sacrificing for everybody else's well-being. And this also gets back into some of the issues we talked about in last time, which is about why is therapy so expensive, is that aspect of the idea of healing, which is something that everybody needs. We're not, our society as we sit right now is not one that is valuing people. It values money, it values the commodity, it values the productivity until you burn yourself out and you're replaced by another cog.
This idea of imposter syndrome that we get, especially just recently graduating or starting, our therapy journey as therapist, it can be kind of harmful in a way, because like you were mentioning, and I'm so glad that you mentioned like money, because that's something a lot of us are not comfortable with, because we are not really taught in school. If you went to a practicum where they sort of like gave you that experience, or they taught you how to do it, or they gave you sort of like ins and outs of that is fantastic, but you have a leg up over everyone else, because that's not a very common experience in other places. But the idea of maybe I'm not worth what what I am charging, or like, why am I charging so much if I'm new to this, I don't really know a lot of things, it can be very difficult. So now I'm in the spot where I am trying to provide low cost psychoeducation to what is it? What's the word? um, Under like served
Mm-hmm.
communities here in California through my nonprofit,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm heavily debating on how much to charge, one, and two, how much information or how valuable is the information that I'm providing, because
Mm-hmm.
I have a perspective too, because I reach out, and a lot of the people I spend my time with are well, now my brother is like he probably can have an honorary degree in mental health because I talked to him so much about it, and he's learning so much through just hanging out with me, that I'm like, oh, this is common. Like all the information that I know about like mental health, it's common knowledge, and I have to constantly remind myself that it's not. It's common maybe in my group of friends, but for the larger population, this isn't common
Right.
knowledge.
Well, one of those things that we have to the assessment of common knowledge isn't common, and it doesn't grow in everybody's garden. And is the garden even set up to grow those flowers?
Mm-hmm.
Is this because so again, this comes back to the notions that we have that have shaped the world last century that we need to start reassessing. As I know, I said during our how explain why things are expensive. When I went to in my law and ethics class, I had a teacher basically tell me most of the people that she knew, and this was a British white woman who came to study therapy, either had good trust funds that were paying for the school,
Mm-hmm.
they had married well, so they had spouses who they were paying for their school, they had good divorce settlements that was paying for their schools. So all of these people, all the things they were talking about were people who probably were in their second and third career. I have none of those things. So
Mm-hmm.
does not mean I'm going to be working from the base of those things as how any of the therapy is being done as being normalized. It's not even how I'm going to be approaching the subject of money. And for many people of color entering this field, we're all coming in that fourth step of not necessarily having this history of, with money that says we can just this is again that poverty mindset that we can offer all the low fee and not have to worry about the cost because we're taking care of there. No, we have to actually work. This is our actual livelihood. So we're actually operating with that. And then, as you said, what does it mean to be normalizing this psychoed, which has not been normalized in our society? Because again, it also makes it easier for people to be manipulated.
There is this I was discussing this with my brother the other day, like just kind of had this after we had the panel, why is therapy so expensive. I just continued thinking about it, and like sort of like the differences of like growing up with money and growing up without money, because
Mm-hmm.
there are so many videos out there of like, this is the habits of the rich people, and those habits they're able to have because they have the money and the possibilities of doing that. But if you were, because a lot of it is like, well, they just put in their money in this type of account and they get so much money back, and I'm like, but I have no money to put in an account like that. Like, how do I get rich like that? You can't.
Mm-hmm.
And there's like basics. I don't know where I even heard this, but there is sort of like even a basic sort of thing that gets taught with to kids who grew up in a family where they had like financial stability, which is like having those conversations about money, like
Mm-hmm.
how you talk or reaching out to people when you need help, and like setting those boundaries for yourself. Those are things that most of us don't really learn, because
Mm-hmm.
money was always sort of like get paycheck, either it goes to like paying bills or it goes to providing money, or whatever it is in the household, and then you end up with nothing. So having those sort of circumstances, you don't have the flexibility of being like, oh, this is how you take care of money, this is how you save. Like things like that are not things that are taught at home, which maybe that's it's school thinking, oh, you're just going to get taught this, like this is just basic knowledge like we were talking about that everybody has, and then it's not.
Right. No, no, because it's and then there's also the aspect of the persons who they got the paycheck and because of their feeling stressed out from all the work, they then went and squandered it all on, oh, which comes back to what I was saying about escapism
Hmm.
and how escapism to certain sectors was seen as a moral failing. So why should we be putting in anything to show that escapism actually has a function for people, as opposed to it a moral failing?
Now I'm kind of slightly worried that we're thinking of joining, the mental health field are going to be like, that sounds really hard. I'd rather not. But it is possible to do this, which is why I want to make these videos, because I want to show people that it is possible for you to have your own practice, for you to be successful at it, and for you to incorporate your geeky, nerdy loves into it as well, and find that community to support you and help you out. It is possible to do this. It may be a little bit more difficult than it is maybe for some of our peers, but it is definitely possible.
Well, one of the other elements there too is we also have to look at what we're being portrayed in media.
Yes.
In many ways, the Marvel MCU, especially the television versions and so forth, have done great wonders in showing mental health providers being there for our various heroes. Now, I have some issues with how they have portrayed some of us and some of the methodologies they've done, which I have to keep in mind. It's like, oh, they're doing this because you've got a 30-minute or an hour-long show, and you're trying to at least do components of your story. There's stuff there that especially like with Falcon and Winter Soldier, as I'm watching that, it's like, you do not do that in therapy. We do not treat that the same way. I mean, I was watching Jordan Peele's Us, and there's an entire scene there. It's like, what the fuck are you doing? You do not have the client sitting, especially a child, sitting in the next room in an open door who can hear this entire conversation between you and the parent.
Yeah.
There is that notion of what and how we're also portrayed in media that also needs to be looked at as influencing what we're doing in what we do and don't do in therapy. I mean, I don't watch BET, but at one point a few years ago, they had a series on where there was a mental health professional on there, and they were watching her, just showing her how her life was breaking up and breaking down. I mean, literally in one of the scenes, they had her sitting in this chair that looked like a throne. And you've done therapy. There's no way in hell we're going to sit for 6 to 8 hours in a chair like that to do therapy. That is ergonomically bad. It is going to basically throw your back. That is, and there is again that sense of what is being portrayed about our actual work. That our media system also plays into play of what it means for a person of color to go into this field. So it's not saying we don't want to give up these things. It's keep in mind, this is what's being done to tell a story. It is not necessarily the reality.
Yes, and there are a lot of successful stories, like Mr. Kirkberg.
I'm still a work in progress, like all of us. Because at this point, I will note that it has been 10 years as of last year that I started doing some form of active psychotherapy with clients. So I've been at this now 10 years. I am now in my 5th year of running my business as well. And yeah, there's definitely been moments of, what am I doing? And then, okay, I'm happy to be doing this. And to me, this is also that standpoint of, I am moving with spirit, who said, go study psychology.
Right.
So there is that unity between, and that balance that I've also said, between the science, the spirituality, and the practicality. And that's the goal I'm seeking to operate in, as opposed to one being bigger than the other.
So I have a panel that I'm going to sneak in here because I want to invite you.
Okay.
I have a panel where I want to discuss how psychology, like if we think about psychology in terms of like D&D, psychology is sort of like equals wisdom and intelligence. And I want to get a lot of other geeky nerd providers to talk about that, because you're basically just kind of talking about that now. And I think it's very important for us to have this discussion. So that's one of the panels that I'll be having soon, which I hope you can join us for.
Hey, as long as you schedule it correctly, because clearly I put my score points in wisdom and intelligence as opposed to strength and necessary constitution or charisma.
Okay, so I don't want to take too much of your time. We already had some technical difficulties we had to deal with, but thank you so much for sharing. And again, like, this is exactly why, like, everything you just said today was exactly why I want to have this series available for anyone to easily access, and why I love talking to you so much. Because when we met in person, we were just like chatting over like Greek food, and I learned so much, and I was like, I feel like I need to like be taking notes right now. So I was like, yes, you're definitely someone I need to pick your brain a little bit, because we can benefit so much from everything that you've learned so far in your journey.
And a bunch of that also came from, what did I try and I failed? How did I make sure to look at how I failed as a lesson for what to do differently? And that's also part of addressing imposter syndrome and getting a hold and getting that to disappear. Is, how are you learning from your failures?
Yes, and with that last bit of wisdom for today, we will end the video. Thank you so much for joining us today. Don't forget to subscribe, like, comment. And if you have different questions or anything, please write them in the comments, and we'll try to address them either in a different panel or bring Mr. Perry back to answer them for us. Yeah, and don't forget to reframe and re-enchant your life.
Very much so. And check out those classic shows.
Yes.